Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're setting sail on an absolutely immense historical journey, diving deep into insights pulled from one single ambitious source. Excerpts from H.G. Wells's A Short History of the World.
That's right. Imagine trying to condense the entire story of Earth and humanity, from cosmic origins all the way up to the early 20th century, into one volume. That's Wells' attempted. Our mission here is, well, to act as your guides, sifting through this colossal narrative.
Yeah, pulling out the most important bits.
Exactly. The key nuggets of knowledge, the surprising facts, and connecting the dots so you can get a well-informed perspective on this vast sweep, quickly and thoroughly.
And vast sweep really is the term, isn't it? The source, right off the bat, challenges those old ideas of history being just, a few thousand years long. It plunges us straight into millions, even billions of years of change. Okay, let's unpack this incredible scale.
Absolutely. The source wastes no time dismissing what it calls the altogether exploded idea of a universe only 6,000 or 7,000 years old. It takes us right back to the Earth's very beginnings.
Right.
Describing our planet, this spheroid sphere nearly 8,000 miles across, its shape understood for some 2,500 years, despite older flat Earth notions as a place of just, well, total chaos.
Chaos feels like the right word. The description is so vivid. Superheated steam everywhere, a stormy atmosphere just full of vapors, an ocean of molten rock boiling beneath these fiery clouds.
Yeah.
Even the sun and moon glare are like hot breaths of flame sweeping swiftly across the surface. It sounds utterly alien.
It does. But the key point the source makes is that over these unimaginable gulfs of time, this intense heat gradually faded. Hot streams started carving across crystallizing rocks, forming pools, lakes, carrying sediment.
Okay.
And what's crucial for the story of life is the description of the landscape before living things really took hold on land.
Which was just emptiness.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Great lava-like masses of rock without traces of soil. Just bare rock. No soil, no earthworms to make soil, no plants to anchor it. Life in the beginning was restricted only to the sea.
So the sea was the cradle, and the source is very specific here. Life didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No.
It grew and grows. This introduces Wells's presentation of organic evolution, not as some sudden event, but a long, slow process, age by age through gulfs of time. Life has been growing from a mere stirring in the intertidal slime towards freedom, power, and consciousness.
And what's particularly striking, and the source really highlights this, is that by Wells's time, the belief in organic evolution had become pretty much accepted across sound Christian, Jewish, and Muslim doctrine. It had moved past that earlier religious resistance.
That's a significant point, that integration of scientific understanding.
It really is.
So what were those first brave stirrings in the intertidal slime, as Wells puts it? What kind of life emerged in those early seas?
Well, back in the Cambrian period, the source tells us you see things like little crustacea, small shellfish, zoophytes, and algae. They apparently resembled much older, larger forms. But here's a fantastic little detail from the source that just sticks with you. Species of the ancient genus Lingula, a type of shellfish from those primordial seas, still live today.
Wait, still live today? Seriously, organisms essentially unchanged after millions upon millions of years. That's wild.
Absolutely incredible persistence, isn't it? The source then moves on to the Devonian period, the age of fishes. Fish diversified greatly, including ancestors of modern sharks and sturgeons.
Right.
But the land, according to the text, remained apparently quite lifeless.
Still just barren rock. So how did life finally make that leap from water onto that desolate land?
Well, that took another immense span of ages. A great variety of animal forms gradually crawled out. We start seeing things like centipedes, millipedes, the first primitive insects.
Primitive insects.
Yeah. And some, like dragonflies, apparently grew to be remarkably large. Also land scorpions, which are related to ancient king crabs, and eventually vertebrated animals.
Vertebrates finally making it ashore. And the adaptation to breathing air, that couldn't have been easy.
Far from it. It was a crucial evolutionary hurdle. It involved either adapting gills with covers or, in the case of vertebrates, developing entirely new internal organs for breathing air.
Okay.
The source highlights how the swimming bladder of certain fish, the thing used for buoyancy,
Yeah.
that gradually evolved into the lung in vertebrates.
The swimming bladder became the lung. That's just a brilliant piece of evolutionary repurposing. So amphibians are the classic example of this transition, right?
Exactly. Animals like frogs and newts, they start life in water breathing with gills.
Yeah.
But then they develop lungs from an outgrowth of the throat, kind of like that swimming bladder structure.
Okay.
Then they transition to land, their gills shrink, The gill slits close up, except for one slit that becomes the ear passage, interestingly enough, and they become air breathers.
Huh.
But as the source notes, they remain tied to the water for reproduction. They still need it to lay their eggs. A true transitional form.
A living echo of that ancient journey from sea to land. Okay, so after the Paleozoic and Azoic eras, which Wells lumps together as spanning maybe 1,400 million years,
Wow.
the source moves to the Mesozoic period, the age of reptiles.
Yep. This era, lasting upwards of 200 million years, is characterized by these widely diffused warm conditions. A hothouse fauna, the source calls it, living in a hothouse flora, enduring no frosts.
The age of, well, the source gives specific examples like the ichthyosaurus, that fish lizard creature, and the pterodactyl.
Yes, a time when giant reptiles really dominated the planet.
Yeah.
And the significant development here, according to Wells, is that the world finally attained a real dry land fauna and flora distinct from the earlier life that was mostly confined to mud and swamps.
Got it. So from cosmic steam to land-conquering reptiles, it's just hard to wrap your head around the depth of time involved. The source then transitions to the Cainozoic period, the era of new life, bringing cooler, bleaker ages.
And the emergence of grasses, which might sound minor, but it dramatically changed landscapes and, food sources. This period also saw a great weeding and extinction of species. A lot of turnover.
And crucially, the rise of mammals and birds. What made these groups so significant according to the source? Why were they different?
They were distinguished by a key characteristic: suckling and cherishing their young. This act of parental care, well, it had profound implications.
Oh, right, because with that care comes
The possibility of learning. Learning by imitation, communication through warning cries, coordinating action, mutual control, even instruction. The source calls this a teachable type of life entering the world.
That's the fundamental shift, not just being programmed by instinct, but actually being capable of acquiring knowledge and behavior from others. That completely changes the game, doesn't it?
It really does. Mammals are described as having these complex urges, sure, but also things like self-restraint, consideration for others, social appeal, and self-control after our own fashion. This teachability, this capacity for relationship, is why we can connect with almost all mammals, why they can be pets, why they can be tamed and taught. It's presented as a direct consequence of that parental care fostering learning.
That makes a lot of sense. The source then brings us to the Great Ice Age, the glacial ages.
Yes, a period spanning many, many centuries, where the Arctic ice cap crept southward, reaching as far as the Thames in England and Ohio in America. This brought about those cold-adapted animals like the woolly rhinoceros and the mammoth.
Right, the classics.
Yeah, and there were periods of warmer spells mixed in with relapses to bitterer cold. It wasn't just one solid freeze.
And it's within this context of dramatic climate shifts that we start looking for the earliest signs of something, something almost human.
Precisely. In the Middle Cainozoic, there were various apes showing, quasi-human traits. But as we approach the glacial ages, the source says we find traces of almost human creatures, often not bones at first, but implements. Exactly. Flint and stone tools showing intentional chipping found in European deposits maybe 500,000 to 1 million years old. And interestingly, these early tools were apparently much bigger than similar implements made by true men later on.
So the tools are the earliest markers we have of this line emerging. That's a powerful insight. The source then details some specific fossil finds known at the time Wells was writing.
It mentions the Heidelberg man, known from just a single jawbone described as clumsy, absolutely chinless, heavier and narrower than a true human jaw. Wells suggests this indicates an inability for articulate speech.
Okay.
Then, the Piltdown skull, Eoanthropus, the Dawn Man. The source presents this one as standing apart, different from Heidelberg or apes, noted for boring holes in bones with no other vestige like him known.
Right, and it's interesting how Wells includes Piltdown here, reflecting the scientific understanding before it was later debunked as a hoax. It really shows the importance of checking the date of your source material.
Absolutely. It's a snapshot of knowledge at that time. The source then discusses the Neanderthalers' skulls and bones found in Neanderthal and elsewhere. Wells is quite definite here. An extinct species of man, physically and mentally, on a different line from our own human line. They endured for hundreds or thousands of years in Europe.
That idea of them being potentially dumb animals comes up later in contrast to true humans.
Yes. Another find mentioned is the Rhodesian man skull. This one is presented as closer to true men than Neanderthal man. The skull was poised erect, teeth and bones quite human, but the face was ape-like with enormous brow ridges and a skull ridge. The source suggests this was likely just one of perhaps many subhuman species that lived back then.
So a complex picture emerges, different hominid species coexisting or succeeding each other, not just a simple single line leading to us. Where do we find the relics of the first true men in this narrative? The ones Wells considers our direct kin.
The source describes them as indisputably kindred with ourselves. Relics found particularly richly in Western Europe, especially France and Spain, dating from maybe 30,000 years ago or possibly more.
And what kinds of relics are we talking about?
Bones, weapons, scratchings on bone and rock, carved fragments, things like mammoth tusks shaped into reindeer, bone daggers engraved with horses' heads, and importantly, the paintings found in caves and on rock surfaces.
Like the famous Altamira cave paintings in Spain.
Exactly. Wells calls them marvelous paintings of bulls and notes. Spain was the richest country for these early, true human relics at the time he was writing.
Those cave paintings, they really are such a powerful connection across tens of thousands of years. It feels like a clear sign of sophisticated minds at work, doesn't it?
It definitely does. The source points out that this whole evolution of higher primates, the great apes, submen, Neanderthalers, early true men, seems to be exclusively an old world phenomenon. Humans apparently first reached America only towards the end of the Old Stone Age. And a detail I found striking. Wells states that even at the very outset of the known human story, mankind was already racially divided into at least two main varieties. He uses examples like the Bushmen and Hottentots of South Africa, and speculates about maybe brownish groups originating from the east-north versus blackish groups from the equatorial south.
The idea that significant racial divisions might predate much of what we think of as human history is, well, it's a sobering point made in the source. Let's talk about the Stone Ages themselves, Paleolithic and Neolithic.
Right. The source distinguishes the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, by its chipped stone implements. It mentions chert implements from Somaliland that look similar to ones found in Europe.
Okay, chipped stone, then the Neolithic.
The Neolithic, the New Stone Age, began maybe 10 to 12,000 years ago in Europe. The key technical shift here is learning not just to chip stone, but also to polish and grind stone implements. Polish stone axes, for example.
Ah, polishing stone. A subtle but significant technological leap. And crucially, this is also when cultivation begins.
Exactly. Polished stone tools and the start of planting seeds mark the Neolithic era. The source offers a comparative example here, noting that less than a century before Wells wrote, a race in Tasmania still survived at a lower Paleolithic level of development. It illustrates the very different paces of human development across the globe.
That's a good reminder that history didn't unfold uniformly for everyone, everywhere. Given the lack of written records from, 40,000 centuries ago, how does the source suggest we understand the minds of these primitive humans? How did they think?
Well, it acknowledges this relies heavily on inference and guesswork. Scientists compare modern primitive peoples to modern civilized people, and they study the pictures and carvings left behind.
Right.
The conclusion Wells presents is that primitive man probably thought, much like a child does in imaginative pictures, acting primarily on emotions. Systematic, logical thinking is described as a much later development. And importantly, they had a strong disposition to believe heroes real.
That inclination to believe heroes real? Some things never change, do they? The source contrasts the potentially dumb animal Neanderthalers with the likely talkativeness of early true men, suggesting that even a very scanty collection of speech was a significant evolutionary advantage.
It makes sense the ability to communicate more complex ideas, even basic ones, plan together, warn each other. That would be a powerful survival tool. Early social practices are also touched upon.
Like ritual sacrifice.
Yes, ritual sacrifice is mentioned, often of a chosen youth who was treated with deference, a kind of sacrificial god king. This practice seems to have become linked to observing the stars and determining the seasons, which then led to myth and star worship.
Ah, connecting the heavens to earthly survival.
Exactly. And the source suggests priests, or maybe priestesses, likely kept this knowledge like how to track seasons for agriculture secret, which gave them power. Though its original purpose was intensely practical, knowledge was the key to planting and harvesting successfully.
Knowledge as a tool for both survival and control. Okay, so by maybe 12 to 15,000 years ago, in the warmer, well-watered parts of the Old World, the source describes these Neolithic communities existing with cultivated fields and a distinct class or tradition of priests.
It gives us a sense of the world map back then. European Russia possibly being swamp and lake, maybe a land bridge still existing at the Bering Straits, connecting Asia and America, and emphasizes that the main racial divisions were already quite distinguishable.
And from these Neolithic roots, we see the emergence of the first quasi-civilized communities.
Yes, by around 6,000 or 7,000 BC, appearing in those fertile regions of Asia and the Nile Valley. The source makes a fascinating comparative note here, saying they were almost at the Peruvian level of development.
Suggesting parallel development happening independently across different continents. Let's zoom in on Sumeria, as described in the source. What were they like?
The Sumerians are pictured as a brownish people with prominent noses. They were real pioneers. They deciphered writing cuneiform. They used bronze. They built these great tower-like temples, ziggurats made of sun-dried brick.
And crucially, they wrote on clay tablets.
Which is why so many of their records are preserved. They had domesticated animals like cattle, sheep, goats, and asses, but interestingly, no horses yet. They fought on foot. Their influence eventually extended from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Red Sea. The source mentions Hammurabi of Babylon in this context, around 2200 BC.
Clay tablets enduring the ages, historians definitely owe them a lot. Early Egypt's history begins around the same time frame. Here, the pharaoh was seen as the living incarnation of the chief god placed above the priests.
Life in these earliest city-states sounds pretty regimented, sunny, toilsome, conventional, with priests directing daily life according to rules and onis derived from watching the stars.
Speaking of records, one of the most pivotal inventions Wells discusses is writing itself. How did that develop?
He sees it as beginning even before Neolithic times, perhaps hinted at in things like the Aegean rock pictures. It started as a kind of abbreviated pictorial method, evolving into more conventionalized picture writing like in China, which, the source notes, never really reached a fully alphabetical stage.
So where did true alphabets come from?
According to the source, they derive from a mixture of Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphic systems, a sort of cross-cultural development.
So it was a blend built on earlier forms. Why does the source stress the importance of writing so much? What did it fundamentally change for humanity?
This is absolutely key in Wells's narrative.
Right.
Writing put agreements, laws, commandments on record.
Wow.
Permanently. This ability to record and retrieve information allowed for the growth of much larger, more complex states and societies than ever before.
Right.
It enabled the preservation and accumulation of knowledge across generations in a way that purely oral tradition just couldn't match. It was a massive leap towards documented history, administration, and complex organization.
That ability to scale society and preserve knowledge.
Yeah, truly revolutionary. Now, while these settled civilizations were flourishing in the fertile river valleys, the source also describes a contrasting way of life developing elsewhere.
That would be nomadic life. This tended to grow in harsher lands areas, maybe too wooded, too arid, or just too climatically unpredictable for reliable agriculture. Nomads generally were hardier peoples.
And these nomadic groups weren't just isolated off on their own. They were a constant source of pressure on the settled civilizations.
Yes, definitely. The source points to nomadic tribes on the northern borders constantly pushing against the early Chinese civilizations. Huns, Mongols, Turks, Tartars are mentioned as being related groups in that region. Similarly, in Europe, you had Nordic peoples emerging from the forests and Mongolian tribes on the East Asian steppes developing nomadic habits that contrasted and frequently clashed with the primitive settled civilizations. It's a recurring theme throughout history, isn't it? That dynamic between settled agriculturalists and nomadic pastoralists. Shifting focus a bit, the source introduces the first peoples to truly master the sea.
The Sea Semites, specifically the Phoenicians, originating from cities like Tyre and Sidon on the Levant coast. They spread primarily as traders and colonizers right across the Mediterranean basin.
Establishing settlements in places like Spain and North Africa, Carthage being the most famous.
Exactly. They undertook extensive coastal expeditions, even going through the Straits of Gibraltar, possibly reaching as far as Madeira. The source even mentions Hiram of Tyre cooperating with King Solomon for Red Sea trade, and a supposed Phoenician expedition that circumnavigated Africa under the Egyptian pharaoh Necho.
Circumnavigating Africa thousands of years ago. If true, that's just incredible seamanship for that time. The source also details the Minoan civilization on Crete.
Yes, this civilization flourished, reaching its peak sometime between the eras of Sargon I of Akkad and Hammurabi of Babylon. The great palace complex at Knossos is described. Interestingly, it wasn't initially fortified.
Oh.
But it seems it was fortified later, as potential threats like the Phoenicians and, as the source puts it, a new and more terrible breed of pirates, the Greeks, grew strong at sea. The palace itself sounds remarkably advanced for its time. It had running water, bathrooms.
Running water in Minoan Crete. That is surprising. And they had festivals, bullfighting apparently similar to modern Spain, gymnastics. And the source mentions the women's clothes were remarkably modern in spirit, featuring things like corsets and flounces.
Corsets and flounces in Minoan Crete. It's one of those little details that makes history feel a bit more tangible. This vibrant civilization was later destroyed, possibly by fire, as the source indicates.
And speaking of those Greek pirates, that brings us to the next major shift, the Aryan migrations.
These are described in the source as barbaric tribes who swept down from the north and east. Their key advantages were iron weapons and the use of horse-drawn chariots. They spoke related Indo-European languages and became a significant affliction for the older Aegean and Semitic civilizations.
Where did they come from?
The Medes and Persians came from the regions around the Black and Caspian Seas. Scythians are also mentioned in this context.
And these Aryan-speaking groups spread widely into Europe.
Yes, very significantly. They moved into France and Britain in what the source describes as two main waves. First, the Goidelic Celts, who brought bronze technology, followed later by the Brythons, who had iron. The Brythons seem to have conquered or absorbed the earlier populations, the ones who built monuments like Karnak and Stonehenge.
Okay.
They also moved into Spain, where they encountered the indigenous Basques and the Phoenician colonists, and various Italian tribes, also Aryan speakers, made their way down the Italian peninsula. Rome itself, emerging as a trading town on the Tiber around the 8th century BC, was inhabited by these Aryan Latins, but intriguingly was initially ruled by Etruscans, a non-Aryan people, possibly related to the earlier Aegean populations.
So Rome had this mixed heritage right from its earliest days. The source mentions similar Aryan progress happening at the eastern edge of their range as well, with the Medes and Persians moving south.
It's presented as a broad pattern. Mobile groups with new military technology impacting the more established, settled regions across the Eurasian supercontinent.
Okay, moving into the great empires of the ancient Near East, the source focuses next on the Assyrian Empire.
Ruling roughly from around 800 BC down to 606 BC. They're described as a new and more vigorous and cruel empire. Their military approach was brutal. The capture of a town meant systematic looting and massacre. Figures like Sargon III and Assurbanipal, who at one point controlled Lower Egypt, are mentioned as key rulers. But eventually, Assyria's power waned.
And it came under attack from multiple directions.
Yes, attacked by the Chaldeans from Mesopotamia to the southeast, and by the Aryan Medes and Persians coming from the northeast. This coalition led to the dramatic fall of the Assyrian capital Nineveh in 606 BC.
And how was the territory divided up?
The spoils were split. The Median Empire took control in the north, with its capital at Ecbatana, and a new Chaldean Empire, sometimes called the Second Babylonian Empire, arose in the south, centered on Babylon under the famous King Nebuchadnezzar.
Right. This is where Cyrus the Persian enters the historical stage.
Exactly. He was initially a subject of the Medes, but he revolted, managed to take the Median capital, Ecbatana, and then went on to conquer Babylon in 539 BC, bringing the Chaldean Empire to an end. He's particularly noted in the source for releasing the Hebrew people from their captivity in Babylon.
The source emphasizes the profound impact of the Babylonian captivity on the Hebrew people. It says they got their history together, evolved tradition, learned civilization, and returned to Jerusalem a very different people. This naturally leads Wells to discuss the Hebrew prophets.
Figures like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Wells presents them as something entirely new, a new sort of men, new and remarkable forces. Their supreme importance, he argues, lies in how they carried the common man's focus past priest and temple, past court and king, and brought him face to face with the rule of righteousness.
Establishing that idea of a direct individual moral responsibility to an eternal and universal God of right.
Precisely. Their powerful pronouncements and writings were preserved, studied, and spread wherever the Jewish diaspora went, attracting non-Jews as well, and disseminating this new kind of religious spirit. The source observes that after their cities fell, the Jews were seen as a people exalted by their sense of a common destiny, which drew others towards their distinct cult and promise.
A truly significant development in the history of religious and ethical thought. Okay, let's return to those Greek tribes, that Aryan branch who came down into the Aegean region before 1000 BC.
The source gives us a little environmental context, noting that elephants were still found in Mesopotamia and lions still roamed Greece in those early days, a good reminder of how much ecosystems have changed over millennia. Their early history and myths were captured in the great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were written down around the 8th, 7th century BC, though they undoubtedly existed in oral tradition much earlier.
And politically, Greece remained notably fragmented, didn't it?
Yes, the geography, all those islands and mountain valleys really worked against large-scale unity. Greece was divided into numerous small city-states, often differing in their racial and tribal compositions, Ionic, Aeolian, Doric, some with mixed Greek and pre-Greek populations. They showed no real tendency towards coalescence into larger kingdoms or empires.
But despite this political fragmentation, the source identifies a fundamentally new thing emerging in Greek intellectual life. What was it?
This is crucial to Wells's narrative. It was the rise of men who were not priests, independently seeking and recording knowledge and openly inquiring into the fundamental mysteries of life and being. This was a significant departure from the older model where knowledge was primarily held and dispensed by established priesthoods or royal courts.
So independent thinkers operating outside the traditional religious or political structures.
Exactly. The source points to figures emerging in the 6th century BC, like Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus, individuals whom we now classify as the first philosophers. They were asking these fundamental questions about the nature of the universe, the basis of knowledge, how things worked.
This new intellectual current then flows towards Socrates, around 430 BC.
Socrates famously shifted the philosophical focus more towards human conduct, the nature of society, and the pursuit of wisdom. His teaching is described by Wells as a high, adventurous teaching that has still to soak into the common intelligence of our race. It's presented as a call to individual intellectual effort and responsibility, urging you to choose to think it out and work it out for yourself.
Empowering the individual mind. His most famous student, Plato, went on to found the Academy in Athens and wrote incredibly influential works like The Republic, which envisioned a kind of communist aristocracy, and The Laws, which laid out a detailed blueprint for a utopian state.
These profound philosophical explorations were happening, of course, against a backdrop of significant political turmoil.
Most notably, the Greco-Persian Wars, that major clash between the expanding Persian Empire under Darius and Xerxes, and the independent, often fractious Greek city-states.
Right. This conflict was sparked by the Ionian Greek cities in Asia Minor revolting against Persian rule. This led to Darius I's punitive expedition, which was famously repulsed by the Athenians at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC.
A legendary victory.
Then came Xerxes' massive invasion a decade later, with famous battles like the heroic stand at Thermopylae and the decisive Greek naval victory at Salamis in 480 BC. These were followed by the battles of Plataea and Mycale in 479 BC, which effectively completed the repulse of the Persian invasion force.
This ended the direct Persian threat to mainland Greece and secured the freedom of the Greek cities in Asia Minor. It's during this period that Herodotus, born around 484 BC, wrote what the source calls the first of written histories, detailing these epic events with, as Wells notes, much picturesqueness.
A foundational text for Western historiography. After the Persian Wars, the source pivots to the rise of Macedon, a kingdom to the north of the main Greek city-states.
Under Philip II, who created a formidable new kind of army, combining disciplined infantry with effective cavalry and archers, his decisive victory at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC brought all of Greece under his effective control, achieving a kind of unity they hadn't managed themselves.
Right. He was even appointed captain general for a planned invasion of the Persian Empire, fulfilling a long-held Greek ambition. But he was assassinated in 336 BC before he could launch it.
His son, Alexander, soon to be Alexander the Great, immediately took up that planned invasion. Crossing into Asia in 334 BC, his campaign was incredibly swift and astonishingly successful.
It really was. His conquest took him right through Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, the heart of the Persian Empire, and all the way to the Indus River Valley in modern-day Pakistan, where he famously fought the Indian king Porus.
A truly epic, but ultimately very short-lived empire. After Alexander's sudden death in Babylon in 323 BC, his vast domain quickly fractured.
Yes, it didn't hold together. It rapidly fell under the control of his ambitious generals, who became local adventurers carving out their own kingdoms. Ptolemy seized Egypt and founded a dynasty there. Antigonus secured Macedonia. The rest, especially the vast Asian territories under Seleucus, remained unstable and contested. The source notes that barbarian raids from the north began to increase during this period of fragmentation. And from the west, a new power, Rome, would eventually emerge to pick up the pieces and unify many of these Hellenistic fragments.
Before we dive fully into Rome's story, the source lingers for a moment on the Hellenistic world that emerged from Alexander's conquests. It particularly highlights the city of Alexandria in Egypt.
Founded under Ptolemy the Syrian, Ptolemy II, the museum and library in Alexandria became an unparalleled center of learning, a real blaze of knowledge and discovery. The source mentions towering figures associated with it, like Euclid, the father of geometry, Archimedes, the brilliant inventor and mathematician, and Herophilus, an anatomist noted for practicing dissection and even, according to some accounts, vivisection.
Vivisection during this period. That suggests some really intense, maybe even ruthless scientific inquiry for the time. But the source notes this intellectual golden age in Alexandria didn't last indefinitely.
No, it declined. The source speculates this might have been due to a lack of truly free thinkers, or perhaps because the knowledge remained largely confined to a small circle of scholars and rulers and did not reach out to the mass of mankind.
So it wasn't widely disseminated or built upon by society at large.
Right. It also points to the slow pace of improvements in bookmaking technology. They were still relying on bulky papyrus and parchment scrolls, while the Chinese had already developed paper, a technology that wouldn't reach the West until the 9th century AD.
So knowledge was preserved, yes, but maybe not spread or applied as productively as it could have been.
Meanwhile, new pressures were building from Central Asia again. The Parthians, described as formidable hosts of mounted bowmen, effectively shattered the Seleucid Empire, one of Alexander's main successor states in Asia during the 3rd century BC. Other nomadic peoples from the northeast were also active and disruptive. The source points out that India, during these centuries when Rome and China were rising, experienced a significant Mongolian drive from the north, leading eventually to the formation of the Kushan Empire, which bridged Central Asia and northern India.
It feels like a constant churning and interaction of peoples across the vast Eurasian landmass, and within this period of flux, another major world religion emerges: Buddhism.
Yes, originating with Prince Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, around 530 BC in northern India. After renouncing his privileged life, he meditated and achieved enlightenment. His teaching offered a path to overcome suffering through detachment, understanding the Four Noble Truths, and following the Eightfold Way.
What was the core focus of his teaching?
The source emphasizes his focus on mental uprightness, upon right aims in speech, right conduct, and honest livelihood. It appealed, Wells says, to generous and self-forgetful ends, and worked to quicken the individual conscience.
The core principle being that the highest good is the subjugation of the self, the ego.
Yes. And interestingly, like Jesus later, his teaching involved no chosen people, no bargaining God. It promoted a sense of universal fatherhood and brotherhood, and he strongly denounced private riches. The source uses that powerful language again here, calling him like some terrible moral huntsman digging mankind out of the snug burrows in which they had lived hitherto.
That's a really vivid description. It suggests a radical challenge to existing norms. Men were dazzled and blinded, and the established priesthoods recognized the fundamental opposition. However, the source also notes that, similar perhaps to how Jesus' personality was later interpreted, Buddha's original teaching was corrupted and coarsened after his death, leading to developments like the idea of Buddha as an incarnate divine wisdom.
Despite these later theological developments, the core ethical teaching spread. It initially spread slowly, but then received a massive boost through its adoption by the powerful Mauryan emperor, King Asoka. Asoka was the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, who had actually met Alexander the Great. Asoka reigned from about 272 to 232 BC.
And Asoka became a major patron and promoter of Buddhism, didn't he?
Absolutely. He actively worked to spread Buddhist teachings across India and beyond. He built roads, hospitals, universities, and famously sent missionaries to propagate the faith. However, the source notes that his empire declined relatively quickly after his death. Wells briefly contrasts the civilizational pressures again. Europe, Western Asia dealing with desert northern nomads, while Chinese civilizations faced that great cloud of nomadic peoples on their northern borders.
Okay, this brings us back decisively to the West and the full emergence of Rome. The source revisits Rome's origins, that little trading city on the Tiber from the 8th century BC, inhabited by Latin-speaking people, but initially under the rule of Etruscan kings, described as a non-Aryan people, possibly akin to the earlier Aegean peoples, and also influenced by the Greek settlements in southern Italy, Magna Graecia.
What was really key to Rome's initial, quite remarkable expansion, starting seriously in the 5th century BC, was its unique policy of inclusion. Rome made it possible and acceptable to extend her citizenship by incorporating more and more outsiders into the Roman state.
This wasn't the typical approach for ancient city-states, was it? They were usually quite exclusive.
No, it was a significant departure, and this policy led to the relatively rapid Latinization of the entire Italian peninsula. By 89 BC, almost all free inhabitants of Italy had become Roman citizens. This willingness to share the club membership, so to speak, was a huge factor in Rome's early strength and growth.
The source then tracks the evolution of the Roman Republic itself. Maybe 2 centuries where soldier farmers fought for freedom and a say in governance, followed by about 100 years where they enjoyed the resulting privileges. Then came the devastating Punic Wars against Carthage. According to the source, these wars wasted these free farmers, impoverished them, and paved the way for what Wells calls the Republic of Adventurous Rich Men.
Right. The traditional republican system became increasingly corrupt and ineffective. Electoral privileges lost their real value. Real power shifted away from the Senate and the people towards powerful military generals whose armies were loyal primarily to them rather than the state figures like Marius and Sulla. The massive slave revolt led by Spartacus is mentioned as a symptom of the deep underlying social tensions and inequalities of this period.
This chronic instability and civil strife eventually led to the First Triumvirate.
Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar effectively dividing control of the vast Roman territories among themselves. Caesar, after making his military reputation conquering Gaul, modern France, eventually clashed with Pompey in a civil war, emerged victorious, and became the undisputed master of Rome, only to be famously assassinated in 44 BC.
His assassination ushered in another period of civil war, eventually leading to the rise of Octavian, later known famously as Augustus.
Right, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir. He defeated his main rival, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC to become the sole supreme power in Rome. The source describes him as being quite different from Julius Caesar, having no foolish craving to be god or king. He shrewdly, at least formally, restored the republic, giving power back to the Senate and people, and declined the title of dictator, beginning his long rule very carefully.
And this marked the definitive end of the Roman Republic and the start of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the famous Pax Romana.
Exactly. From 31 BC, lasting until about 180 AD, this was an extended age of relative peace, stability, and considerable development across the vast Roman Empire. The empire reached its maximum geographical extent around 100 AD, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, reaching the Euphrates River, although the source notes it was probably too remote to go further east effectively.
How does the source characterize the nature of this Roman Empire?
It describes it as incorporating diverse peoples, including Nordic Aryans and Greeks, but being perhaps less dominated by Hamitic and Semitic populations compared to earlier Near Eastern empires. Wells considers it a first attempt to rule a great dominion upon mainly Aryan lines, essentially an expanded Aryan republic. He contrasts it with the older pattern of empires centered on a personal conqueror ruling from a capital city focused on a harvest god temple. Roman state gods, he notes, were largely equivalent to the Greek pantheon.
Turning to Roman society during the empire, the source highlights that major agricultural shift we touched on earlier. The decline of the free Roman farmer and the rise of large agricultural states, latifundia, worked primarily by slave labor. This happened particularly after the Punic Wars.
Right. Slave gangs became a common feature not just in Italy but across the Hellenized world as well. These slaves were typically captives from Rome's many wars, speaking a multitude of languages.
Were there any changes to their status over time?
Yes. The source notes that Roman law did gradually evolve to offer slaves some protections and rights over time. Restrictions were placed on extreme cruelty, like a master couldn't just sell a slave to fight beasts in the arena. Slaves gained limited property rights, known as peculium, were sometimes paid wages as an incentive, and slave marriage eventually gained some legal recognition. However, the source also argues that the slave system was fundamentally less efficient for many types of agriculture and production compared to free labor. This period of the early empire also saw significant growth in the size and importance of towns and cities.
Life under the Roman Empire, particularly during those first 2 centuries AD of the Pax Romana, is painted by the source with a rather dark undertone. It says the soul of the time was worried and frustrated.
It depicts a society characterized by compulsion, cruelty, overt pride, and ostentatious display, but with a little genuine honor or serenity. The fortunate were often insecure and focused on immediate gratification, while the unfortunate were despised and lived in wretched conditions. Life in the cities, for many, often seemed to revolve around the brutal, red excitement of the arena.
The religious landscape during this period sounds fascinatingly complex and dynamic. You had the old state religions.
Right, the traditional temple-centered practices involving formal observances, rituals often driven by fear, sacrifices, and various mysteries. The deities involved, Wells notes, often seemed monstrous and illogical to our modern minds because we belong to an Aryanized world. But for the peoples of the time, these beliefs held immediate conviction. The conquest and mixing of peoples during this era also led to widespread theocrasia, the fusion and assimilation of similar gods from different pantheons. Jupiter might be identified with Zeus, for instance.
And into this somewhat formal, maybe spiritually unfulfilling state religious structure emerge these new, more personal, private immortality religions.
Exactly. These mystery cults, according to the source, effectively took all the heart and emotion out of the old state religions. Cults like that of Serapis, a syncretic deity blending Egyptian Osiris, Isis, and Horus with aspects of Greek, Roman, and even Persian gods, spread incredibly widely across the empire. They promised personal salvation, immortality of compensations, and consolation to individuals living in a world perceived as hopelessly wretched. Serapis was explicitly called the savior of souls.
So very direct appeal to personal anxieties and hopes.
Definitely. Another very popular one mentioned is Mithraism, centered on the Persian sun god Mithras. This was particularly popular among soldiers, a kind of soldier's god, offering camaraderie and a promise of salvation.
So, alongside the formal, perhaps rather cold state worship of Jupiter or the emperor, there was this vibrant, emotionally charged undercurrent of these mystery cults offering personal solace and hope for the afterlife. The source also makes sure to mention the presence of Jewish synagogues.
Yes, Jewish communities were spread throughout the empire, gathering in synagogues to read the Torah, their Bible, and uphold their distinct faith in a single unseen God. This often led to conflicts, particularly due to their strict monotheism and refusal to participate in the obligatory state sacrifices to the emperor, which they saw as idolatry.
And the source briefly notes the existence of Eastern ascetics, men and women who renounced worldly pleasures in marriage even before the time of Buddha, highlighting a long-standing tradition of spiritual seeking through withdrawal and self-denial in that part of the world. This complex religious ferment sets the scene for the emergence of the teaching of Jesus.
Right. The source states that the only direct sources we have for his life and teaching are the four Gospels in the New Testament. Wells asserts that these texts convey a, quote, very definite personality. One is obliged to say, here was a man, this could not have been invented. But importantly, he also makes the point that, much like Buddha's personality and original message, Jesus's were later distorted or overlaid by subsequent forms of his religion.
What does the source present as the core message of Jesus' teaching?
As presented by Wells, Jesus fundamentally swept away their dear securities, particularly referring to the Jewish sense of having a special exclusive bargain or covenant with God. He taught that God was not a bargainer, that there were no chosen people and no favorites in the kingdom of heaven.
A universal message, then.
Absolutely. God was portrayed as the loving Father of all life, as incapable of showing favor as the universal Son. All human beings were brothers, sinners alike and beloved sons alike. The parable of the Good Samaritan is used as a prime example of this radical, boundary-breaking universal love.
And this had profound social implications as well.
Immense implications. His teaching, as interpreted by Wells, condemned all the gradations of the economic system, all private wealth and personal advantages. In the kingdom of God, he proclaimed, everything belonged to the kingdom. A righteous life was one of complete service to God's will, using all one's possessions and abilities for that purpose. He explicitly denounced private riches and even the reservation of a purely private life separate from this commitment.
The source uses that powerful phrase again, calling him like some terrible moral huntsman digging mankind out of the snug burrows in which they had lived hitherto. In his vision of the kingdom, there was to be no property, no privilege, no pride and precedence, no motive in deed, and no reward but love.
It was a radical, demanding message. Men were dazzled and blinded and cried out against him. And the established religious and political authorities, the priests, immediately recognized the fundamental conflict without any possibility of compromise.
After Jesus' death, the source highlights the crucial role of Paul of Tarsus.
Yes, Paul taught that Jesus was not only the Christ, the expected Messiah of the Jews, but also that his death was a divine sacrifice for the redemption of all mankind. Consciously linking it, the source suggests, to ancient sacrificial traditions familiar across the ancient world. Wells briefly notes here how religions often borrow features from one another, citing Buddhism and Taoism as another example of syncretism.
How did early Christianity spread?
It spread quite rapidly through the Roman Empire during the first 2 centuries AD, weaving converts into a distinct and growing new community. The attitudes of Roman emperors varied significantly over time, swinging between periods of relative hostility and active persecution and periods of toleration. The last major empire-wide persecution occurred under Emperor Diocletian starting in 303 AD. It aimed to seize church property and burn Christian writings, but ultimately failed, partly because Christianity had already spread so widely, even reaching into the imperial administration and army. Many officials and a significant portion of the population were already Christian or sympathetic.
This leads to the pivotal shift under Emperor Constantine the Great.
Right. Constantine initially acted as a friend and patron to the church and became a deathbed convert himself. He, along with his co-emperor Licinius, issued the Edict of Milan, often dated 313, though Galerius issued an earlier Edict of Toleration in 311, granting religious freedom. Constantine increasingly favored Christianity, and by 324 AD, after defeating his rivals, he effectively made it the preferred state-supported religion. Paganism began to be actively suppressed.
And the source highlights Christianity's crucial role during the subsequent period of decline in the West.
Yes, during the chaotic centuries of barbaric confusion in Western Europe following the collapse of Roman authority, the Christian Church, particularly through its network of monasteries and dedicated missionaries, was instrumental in preserving what remained of the classical tradition of learning and literacy.
However, the source also notes that internal challenges arose within the now dominant church, particularly doctrinal disputes.
Absolutely. Intense debates erupted about the fundamental nature of Jesus, was he divine, human, or both, and the complex doctrine of the Holy Trinity. Major church councils, like the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, were convened to define Orthodox belief. This led to the formulation of creeds, like the Nicene Creed and later the Athanasian Creed, which defined the Trinity doctrine. Wells argues that these intricate theological disputes absorbed a vast amount of intellectual energy that might otherwise have been directed elsewhere.
While these debates raged, Christianity also continued to spread beyond the old Roman borders.
Yes, significantly. It spread among various German tribes, the Goths, Franks, Vandals, Burgundians, many of whom initially adopted Arian Christianity, a version holding a minority view on the Trinity, that Jesus was subordinate to God the Father, which put them at odds with the Nicene orthodoxy centered in Rome and Constantinople.
This period of theological consolidation also coincided with increasing pressure on the Roman frontiers, starting seriously from the 3rd century AD onwards.
The source details the various groups pushing relentlessly against the empire's borders. Franks and other German tribes along the Rhine frontier, Vandals moving through Gaul and Spain into North Africa, Visigoths, Westgoths, pushed into the Balkans and later Italy and Spain, Ostrogoths, Eastgoths, also pressured, Alans swept across Europe, and behind many of these westward movements were the Huns, pushing out from Central Asia. Simultaneously, the revived Sassanid Persian Empire was a constant military threat in the east.
But source makes an interesting distinction between the German tribes and the Huns.
Yes, the Germans were generally portrayed as agricultural settlers, albeit often on the move and engaging in warfare, whereas the Huns were depicted as much more purely nomadic, focused primarily on raiding, plundering, and extracting tribute, rather than settling down and farming the lands they conquered.
And under their famous leader, Attila, the Huns were a truly devastating force in the mid-5th century.
Wells describes Attila effectively bullying the Eastern Roman Emperor, Theodosius II, and launching destructive raids across the Balkan Peninsula, allegedly destroying some 70 cities. They then famously invaded Gaul, France.
Where they were defeated.
Yes, defeated at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, often called the Battle of Chalon, in 451 AD, by a combined army of Romans under General Aetius and Visigoths under King Theodoric III. Attila then invaded Italy the following year, sacking several cities, but was supposedly persuaded to turn back from marching on Rome itself by an embassy led by Pope Leo I. Attila died suddenly in 453.
And after Attila's death, the source says the Western Roman Empire basically disintegrated rapidly.
It really did. The remaining imperial authority crumbled. In 476 AD, Odoacer, a Germanic general in the Roman army, deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and simply informed the Eastern Roman court in Constantinople that there was no longer an emperor ruling in the West. The source concludes rather starkly that the Latin Roman Empire ended so ingloriously. Theodoric the Ostrogoth later defeated Odoacer and became king of Italy, ruling from Rome in 493.
Western and Central Europe after this collapse is painted as a very fragmented and chaotic picture.
Yes, a medley, as Wells puts it, of independent barbarian chiefs reigning as kings, dukes, counts, etc. There were hundreds, even thousands, of such local rulers, practically independent, but often maintaining a sort of shadowy, theoretical allegiance to the distant emperor in Constantinople. Latin speech survived, but became increasingly distorted, evolving into the early forms of the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, in Gaul, Spain, Italy, and Dacia. German and Slavonic languages dominated elsewhere.
What about learning and culture?
Latin itself became largely confined to the clergy and a very small remnant of educated laymen. Life was highly insecure, property held mainly by force, leading to the proliferation of castles. Roads decayed, trade diminished. The source calls the dawn of the 6th century an age of profound division and of intellectual darkness in the West. It explicitly states that Latin learning might well have vanished completely without the dedicated efforts of monks in monasteries and Christian missionaries.
Given such a powerful, enduring entity, its eventual inglorious end really prompts the question, why did Rome fall? The source takes time to synthesize the key reasons presented.
It attributes Rome's initial rise and cohesion primarily to the powerful idea of citizenship. Throughout the expanding republic and the early empire, a very large number of men felt a genuine connection to Roman citizenship. They saw it as a valuable privilege that came with obligations, but also guaranteed rights. They felt confident in their legal standing and were generally willing to make sacrifices for the Roman state. The prestige of Rome, its system of law, and its formidable army were strong unifying forces.
But the decay came from a combination of internal rot and that relentless external pressure we discussed.
Exactly. The source points to the gradual loss of that vibrant spirit of citizenship as absolutely crucial. The replacement of the free Roman farmer, the early backbone of the Republic and his army, with vast slave labor agricultural estates, latifundia, particularly after the Punic Wars, is seen as leading to social degeneration, inequality, and ultimately devastating civil wars. Leaders came to rely on professional legions loyal primarily to themselves, not on a citizen militia fighting for the Republic. The empire, in this view, eventually became something akin to a vast slave farm.
This internal decay manifested in other ways, too.
Yes, it led to population decline, a general loss of vigor and civic participation, increasingly crippling and corrupt tax collection, and frequent debasement of the currency. The whole imperial system, which had relied heavily on conquest, plunder, and expansion for its economic vitality, simply couldn't sustain itself once expansion effectively stopped around 100 AD. It couldn't hold together against both the constant outer pressure and this deep inner decay. Land even went out of cultivation in many areas.
A comprehensive and rather bleak assessment of a colossal systemic failure. But importantly, as the Western Empire fell into this period of darkness, the eastern part of the Roman Empire managed to survive.
Yes, the empire had been formally split into eastern and western administrative halves in 395 AD. The eastern part, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, with its strategically vital capital Constantinople, held out for another 1,000 years. It successfully defended most of Asia Minor against the powerful Sassanid Persians during this period.
And there was even a notable, though ultimately temporary, revival of Eastern Roman power in the 6th century.
Under Emperor Justinian I, who reigned from 527 to 565. He's described as a ruler of great ambition and energy, powerfully aided by his influential wife, Empress Theodora. Justinian launched ambitious campaigns to reconquer lost Western territories.
And he had some success.
Considerable success, initially. His generals, notably Belisarius, managed to reconquer North Africa from the Vandals and most of Italy from the Ostrogoths. They even regained parts of southern Spain. Justinian is also famous for his codification of Roman law and for commissioning the magnificent church of Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, in Constantinople.
The Sassanid Empire in Persia also continued as a major power during this time, right?
Yes, the Sassanid dynasty had revived Persian power in 227 AD and remained a formidable rival to Rome Byzantium until the Arab Muslim conquests in the 7th century.
What was the state of intellectual life in both the Byzantine and Sassanid empires during this 6th century period, according to the source?
Generally stagnant. Science and political philosophy seemed largely dead or dormant. Philosophers and scholars preserved ancient texts, often with great reverence, but according to the source, frequently with a lack of understanding or critical engagement. The ongoing social and political chaos certainly contributed to this intellectual decline. But Wells highlights another key factor he believes contributed to this sterility. He argues that both empires became religious empires in a new way, characterized by increasing intolerance and the enforcement of strict religious orthodoxy, whether Christian or Zoroastrian. This, he contends, greatly hampered the free activities of the human mind. The split between the Eastern and Western churches also reflected this hardening of doctrinal lines.
Intolerance presented as a major killer of free thought and innovation. That provides a really stark contrast to the picture the source paints of contemporary China under the Tang dynasty.
It really does. The Tang dynasty, particularly under Emperor Taizong, who began his reign in 627 AD, is described by Wells in glowing terms as having an open, tolerant, and inquiring mind. He even received an embassy from Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor.
And notably, the Tang court even welcomed Christian missionaries in 635 AD.
Yes, Nestorian Christian missionaries arrived. They were allowed to explain their beliefs, and Emperor Taizong apparently examined a Chinese translation of their scriptures and pronounced this strange religion acceptable. The source notes that foreign religions, including Buddhism and Zoroastrianism, were generally permitted and even studied in Tang China during this period. This cosmopolitan openness stands in sharp contrast to the increasing religious intolerance described in the Byzantine and Sassanid empires at the same time.
Meanwhile, back in the Arabian Peninsula, a new, incredibly dynamic religious and political force was emerging: Muhammad and Islam.
Right. Muhammad was born in Mecca around 570 AD. Mecca was an important trading center, but its prosperity also depended heavily on the annual pilgrimages to the Kaaba shrine located there. Muhammad began preaching a message that God was one, Allah, that there should be no idols, no intermediary priests, and that the relationship between the individual and God was direct and personal.
Which, understandably, made him very unpopular with the established powers in Mecca.
Naturally. His message directly threatened the lucrative income derived from the traditional polytheistic pilgrimages to the Kaaba. He declared himself the last and final prophet of God, sent to perfect religion, viewing figures like Abraham and Jesus Christ as his legitimate predecessors in this prophetic line. He produced the verses he said were communicated directly to him by God, which were later compiled into the Quran.
This opposition led to the Hijra in 622 AD, his crucial flight from Mecca to the nearby city of Medina. This event marks the beginning of the Muslim calendar.
From Medina, Muhammad consolidated his following. He eventually returned to conquer Mecca peacefully and spread his political and religious authority over the rest of the Arabian Peninsula until his death in 632. The source includes a notably frank, even critical, assessment of Muhammad's life, particularly in his later years, mentioning his marrying multiple wives and describing him as a complex figure compounded of very considerable vanity, greed, cunning, self-deception, and quite sincere religious passion. He dictated the Quran, and the face of Islam grew rapidly.
And after Muhammad's death, the expansion of Islam under his successors, the caliphs, was incredibly, astonishingly rapid.
It was truly remarkable. Within decades, Arab Muslim armies conquered Syria, Egypt, the entire Sassanid Persian Empire, and swept across North Africa. They invaded Spain via the Strait of Gibraltar in 711 AD. By 715, the Caliph's empire stretched all the way from the Pyrenees to China.
Were there any checks on this expansion?
Yes. They were famously halted in their attempt to conquer Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, after a long siege from 717-18. And in Western Europe, the Frankish leader Charles Martel defeated a large Muslim raiding party near Poitiers in central France in 732, which effectively stopped their further northward advance into Gaul.
Initially, the source describes the Arabs as being relatively tolerant conquerors, especially compared to some earlier empires. And perhaps more importantly for the long term, their vast empire became a major center for intellectual life and preservation.
It truly was a golden age for learning in the Islamic world. They played a vital role in preserving much of the classical Greek learning they encountered, often via existing Syriac Christian translations. They also found significant Greek scholarship surviving in places like Egypt, and they benefited from a vibrant Jewish intellectual tradition, particularly in Spain, Al-Andalus.
And they interacted with other cultures too.
Yes, in Central Asia, they came into contact with Buddhist traditions and Chinese civilization. Crucially, they learned the technique of paper manufacture from the Chinese, a technology, Wells explicitly notes, made printed books possible, much later in Europe. They also absorbed and significantly advanced Indian mathematics, including the numerals we now use, often called Arabic numerals, and philosophy.
Baghdad, the newly founded capital of the Abbasid caliphs, became a particularly vibrant center.
Described by Wells as a blaze of learning, literature, and philosophy. It became home to numerous influential scholars, translators, and scientists like Al-Kindi, Al-Razi, Reyes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna. Later in Islamic Spain, Averroes, Ibn Rushd from Cordova, produced influential translations and commentaries on Aristotle that would profoundly impact Christian scholastic philosophy in medieval Europe when they were translated into Latin.
The Arab experimental chemists, the alchemists, also played a surprisingly key role in scientific development, didn't they?
Yes, this is a fascinating point Wells makes. While they were often initially pursuing mystical or commercially driven goals, like transmuting base metals into gold, the philosopher's stone, or finding an elixir of life, and often kept their methods secret. In the process, they developed many valuable practical techniques in metallurgy, creating alloys, discovering new dyes, and perfecting methods of distillation.
So they laid groundwork.
Exactly. The source makes this remarkable claim. The last alchemists became the first experimental philosophers. While they were seeking seemingly impossible goals, they stumbled upon and refined the methods of modern experimental science. Careful observation, measurement, experimentation. These methods, Wells argues, would eventually give humanity illimitable power over the world and over his own destiny.
That's a powerful and perhaps unexpected link from ancient mystical pursuits directly to the foundations of modern scientific methodology. Meanwhile, back in Western Europe during the same period, roughly 7th, 10th centuries, Latin Christendom occupied a much smaller, more fragmented, and intellectually less vibrant space compared to the vast, unified, and dynamic Arab world.
The source tracks the rise of the Frankish kingdoms in what is now France and Germany. Clovis, a key early Frankish king, late 5th, early 6th century, converted to Nicene Catholic Christianity, aligning his kingdom with Rome rather than the Arian Christianity common among other Germanic tribes. Much later, Charles Martel, technically the mayor of the palace, the power behind the throne, famously defeated that Muslim raiding force at Poitiers in 732. His son, Pepin the Short, with papal approval, deposed the last Merovingian king and was crowned king of the French in 751, founding the Carolingian dynasty.
Leading eventually to Pepin's grandson, the most famous Carolingian, Charlemagne, who began his long reign in 768.
Charlemagne ruled a very large realm encompassing modern France, Germany, the Low Countries, and northern Italy. He controversially revived the title of Latin Emperor in the West, being crowned by the Pope in Rome on Christmas Day, 800 AD. He conquered North Italy and became the effective master of Rome. However, looking at it from a broader world history perspective, the source describes this deliberate continuation of the Latin Roman Empire tradition in the West as ultimately cramping and disastrous.
How so? Why disastrous?
Because it perpetuated a political fragmentation and rivalry. Europe became, as Wells puts it, a medley of struggling monarchs, princes, dukes, bishops, and cities. There was a growing antagonism between the French-speaking western part of Charlemagne's empire and the German-speaking eastern part. And much of the political energy was consumed by the ongoing ambition, particularly among German rulers, to possess Rome and claim the imperial title bestowed there.
And the church in Rome itself played a very significant role in this complex political power struggle, didn't it?
Absolutely. The popes, based in Rome, increasingly resolved to make the papacy itself the effective supreme authority, perhaps even the emperor, in the West. They controlled Rome, they wielded immense ideological power and propaganda through their network of priests, and crucially, they held the keys of heaven and hell in the imaginations of most people. They constantly maneuvered to gain the submission of secular princes.
Adding yet another layer of complexity and potential conflict was the surviving Greek emperor in Constantinople, who still theoretically claimed universal imperial allegiance, a claim generally ignored or rejected in the West. This political and cultural divide, combined with a significant theological dispute over the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, the Filioque Clause, led eventually to the final rupture, the Great Schism, between the Latin Catholic and Greek Orthodox churches in 1054.
These deep-seated political and religious antagonisms further fueled the conflicts and fragmentation that characterized much of medieval Latin Christendom.
After Charlemagne's empire inevitably broke up, the title of Holy Roman Emperor eventually passed to German rulers. Otto I, a Saxon, was elected King of Germany in 919 and was crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome in 962, reviving the imperial ideal.
Right. This German-based Holy Roman Empire persisted, though often weakly, for centuries. But the powerful feudal rulers in the West, particularly the King of France, Hugh Capet became king in 987, founding a long-lasting dynasty, speaking French dialects, remained largely independent and outside the effective control of the German emperors. Britain, notably, was never part of the Holy Roman Empire at all.
Within this fragmented political landscape, the source points out that religious questions increasingly became, at last, the central questions of European political life. This intense religious fervor manifested most dramatically in the Crusades, starting in the late 11th century.
These expeditions stemmed initially from a genuine religious revival and a powerful desire, fueled by papal appeals, to liberate the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem from Muslim rule, then under the Seljuk Turks.
But they weren't straightforward military campaigns.
No. There was immense popular enthusiasm, sometimes turning against the established clergy. The ill-fated People's Crusade blundered into Anatolia and was massacred. The main Crusades, led by knights and nobles, did manage to capture Jerusalem in 1099, establishing feudal crusader states in the Levant. However, Saladin, a brilliant Kurdish leader who united Muslim forces, recaptured Jerusalem in 1187. This prompted the Third Crusade, led by famous kings like Richard the Lionheart, which ultimately failed to retake the city.
And the Fourth Crusade took a particularly infamous turn.
Yes, the source is highly critical of the Fourth Crusade, 1202-1204. It notes they shockingly turned aside from fighting Muslims and instead attacked the Christian Byzantine Empire, ultimately storming and brutally sacking Constantinople in 1204. There was not even a pretense, Wells writes, of fighting the Turks.
Turning on fellow Christians instead of the supposed infidel target. The source isn't gentle in its critique of the Latin Church's actions and ambitions during this period either.
No, definitely not. It describes the church hierarchy often fighting against popular religious enthusiasm when it couldn't control it, rigidly forcing doctrinal orthodoxy, and brutally persecuting groups deemed heretical, like the Albigensians, Cathars, in southern France, who were subjected to a devastating crusade and massacre. The papacy itself, particularly under powerful popes like Innocent III, was increasingly aiming for direct political rule over all of Europe.
This papal ambition for temporal power was significantly challenged by figures like the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II Hohenstaufen in the 13th century.
Right. Frederick II was a remarkable figure. King of Sicily, as well as emperor, he maintained a sophisticated multicultural court that included educated Arabs. He repeatedly clashed with the papacy, particularly Pope Gregory IX, who excommunicated him multiple times. Frederick defied the Pope, even going on his own crusade, the Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, while under excommunication and, remarkably, negotiated temporary Christian control of Jerusalem through diplomacy rather than warfare.
Why is his defiance seen as so significant?
The source highlights this as significant because it shows that a powerful secular prince in the 13th century could openly challenge and defy the Pope's authority, even his spiritual sanctions like excommunication, without popular indignation, necessarily turning against the ruler. This indicated a subtle but definite decline in the Church's unquestioned prestige and power. Rome ultimately defeated Frederick's Hohenstaufen dynasty after his death, but the long struggle left the Church's own prestige badly wounded, contributing, Wells argues, to its later decay.
The Great Schism of the Papacy, 1378 to 1417, when there were rival popes in Rome and Avignon, is also mentioned as further damaging papal authority and contributing to people beginning to question the Church and think more for themselves in matters of religion.
And alongside these high-level power struggles, new religious forces like the Franciscan and Dominican mendicant orders also emerged within the Church, playing a complex and significant role in this evolving religious landscape, sometimes reinforcing papal authority, sometimes challenging it through their focus on poverty and popular preaching.
Okay, shifting focus back eastward again for a moment. The source discusses the immense impact of the Mongol conquests, which erupted out of Central Asia beginning in the early 13th century.
Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, who unified the disparate Mongol tribes, they created the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching eventually from China all the way to Poland and Hungary in Eastern Europe. The source points out their military genius and discipline, noting they decisively defeated a combined army of Poles and Germans at the Battle of Liegnitz in Lower Silesia, Poland, in 1241 with consummate strategy.
But then, just as they seemed poised to overrun Central Europe, they withdrew quite suddenly. Why?
Yes, their withdrawal was rather abrupt. It was primarily due to the death of the great Khan Ogdai back in Mongolia in 1242. Mongol tradition required all the senior princes and generals to return east for the election, Kurultai, of a successor. After this, their main focus shifted back towards consolidating their conquests in Asia, particularly China.
What happened to their empire after that?
They successfully conquered the southern Sung dynasty in China, establishing their own Yuan dynasty there under Kublai Khan. They ruled southern Russia for centuries as the Golden Horde. Interestingly, the source notes a religious divergence. The eastern Mongols largely adopted Buddhism, while the western Mongols in Persia and the Golden Horde gradually converted to Islam. China eventually overthrew Mongol rule, establishing the native Ming dynasty in 1368, and the Russians remained tributary to the Golden Horde until 1480. There was a brief, brutal revival of Mongol-style conquest under Timur the Lame, in the late 14th century. He conquered vast territories from India to Egypt and defeated the rising Ottoman Turks, but his empire quickly fragmented after his death. However, Babur, one of his descendants, went on to found the powerful Mughal Empire in India in the 16th century.
Another group profoundly impacted, even displaced, by the initial Mongol sweep were the Ottoman Turks.
Exactly. Originally driven from their homeland in Turkestan by the Mongol expansion in the 13th century, they established themselves in Anatolia, Asia Minor. From there, they steadily expanded their power, eventually crossing into Europe, the Dardanelles, and conquering large parts of the Balkans, including Macedonia, Serbia, and Bulgaria.
This inexorable advance culminated in the famous fall of Constantinople in 1453.
Right. The Ottoman Sultan Muhammad II, Mehmed the Conqueror, finally took the ancient Byzantine capital after a long siege, notably utilizing large numbers of cannons, which marked a significant shift in siege warfare technology. This event caused considerable excitement and alarm in Europe, with calls for a new crusade. But the source notes rather dryly that the day of the Crusades was past.
The Ottomans didn't stop there, did they? Their expansion continued well into the 16th century.
No, they continued to grow. They conquered Baghdad, extending their reach into Mesopotamia. They pushed deep into Europe, conquering most of Hungary. They took control of Egypt and most of North Africa. Their powerful fleet dominated the Mediterranean Sea for a time. They even besieged Vienna, the Habsburg capital, and exacted tribute from the Holy Roman Emperor.
So a vast and powerful Islamic empire dominating the Eastern Mediterranean and pushing into Europe. Meanwhile, back in Western Europe, as these grand empires rose and fell and clashed, the source highlights a slower but perhaps ultimately more transformative intellectual revival taking root, particularly from the 13th century onward.
It specifically introduces Roger Bacon, an English Franciscan friar from Oxford, active in the mid-13th century. Wells boldly calls him the father of modern experimental science. His writings, though perhaps not widely influential in his own time, are described as a long tirade against ignorance. He forcefully insisted on the crucial need for direct observation and experiment. Experiment, experiment was his mantra. Wells sees Bacon as embodying a return to the critical, empirical spirit of ancient thinkers like Aristotle.
This intellectual awakening, this renewed interest in observation and questioning, was undoubtedly helped by the increased contact with the Arab world, through places like Spain and Sicily, and also by the influx of Greek texts and scholars after the fall of Constantinople. These connections reintroduced European scholars to a vast body of ancient Greek knowledge that had been largely lost or forgotten in the West.
And absolutely crucially, this period saw the development and spread of the printing press with movable type in Europe. The source mentions an early printing press, and the Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1454, is the first major printed book in Europe using this technology. Wells considers printing, the basic idea of which he notes likely arrived from China via the Arabs, and the parallel development of the sturdy ocean-going sailing ship as the most immediately revolutionary inventions of this era.
Why were those so revolutionary? What did printing in particular unleash?
Printing directly fueled the age of discovery that was dawning. Think about it. Suddenly you could mass-produce maps, astronomical tables, navigational charts, accounts of voyages. This made knowledge much more accessible and affordable, spurring on exploration and intellectual ferment.
So printing enabled the dissemination of the knowledge needed for exploration.
Exactly. It powered figures like Columbus, who crossed the Atlantic to the Americas in 1492, famously believing he'd reach the East Indies. Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope to reach India directly by sea in 1498, opening up a crucial new trade route. And Ferdinand Magellan's expedition completed the first circumnavigation of the globe between 1519 and 1522, definitively proving the Earth was round and revealing the true scale of the Pacific Ocean.
The realization that there was an entire new world, the Americas, added vastly to Europe's known resources and potential fields for exploitation and settlement. This sparked an unprecedented boom in overseas enterprise and competition.
Simultaneously, back in Europe, the authority of the papacy, already weakened by internal issues like its perceived pride, its history of persecutions, its over-centralization, and the damaging Great Schism, was facing increasingly open challenges. Insurrection against its power came from within the church itself, with figures like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia advocating for reforms. Hus was condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake in 1415, which triggered a major Hussite insurrection in Bohemia.
This simmering discontent and questioning set the stage perfectly for the explosive events of the Protestant Reformation, which erupted in Germany, centered around the actions of Martin Luther starting in 1517.
And this is where the impact of printing became immediately dramatically apparent. Europe, thanks to the press, was rapidly becoming a world of readers on a scale never seen before in history. The source calls this transformation a sudden irrigation of the general mind. And this happened precisely at a time when the established church was perceived as confused, divided, and corrupt, and when many secular princes were actively looking for ways to weaken the church's hold on wealth and political influence within their territories.
Luther's actions, challenging papal authority and doctrines, led to immense religious and political conflict across Europe.
Absolutely. He came into direct conflict with the Pope, with the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and eventually sparked wars between Catholic and Protestant princes and states that would ravage Europe for over a century. Peasant revolts, driven by long-standing social and economic grievances, also became dangerously interwoven with the religious disturbances unleashed by the Reformation. And the empire itself was under constant pressure from external attacks by rivals like France and the Ottoman Turks during this tumultuous period.
Emperor Charles V ruled over an incredibly vast inherited domain: the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and its burgeoning American colonies, the wealthy Netherlands, parts of Italy.
He spent most of his reign struggling constantly to hold this sprawling inheritance together against powerful rivals like Francis I of France and the formidable Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent. The brutal sack of Rome in 1527 by his own unpaid, mutinous imperial troops, mostly German Lutherans and Spanish Catholics, is mentioned as a grim low point. Exhausted by decades of warfare and the intractable religious divisions, Charles V eventually abdicated his many titles in 1555-56.
The source includes a rather poignant description of his retirement to a monastery in Spain.
Yes, living in relative simplicity, apparently tinkering with mechanical clocks and toys, and engaging in intense private religious observances, reportedly including scourging himself. It's quite a striking image of the world's most powerful ruler ending his days in self-imposed asceticism and perhaps disillusionment.
The source notes that from this point, the 16th century onward, the focus of European history begins to shift somewhat.
Yes, Wells argues that purely dynastic changes and rivalries, while still important, become less the sole driving force. History increasingly becomes what he describes as an unconscious effort by European societies to adapt to the rapidly changing conditions brought about by the discoveries, the Reformation, new technologies, and new ideas. It becomes a story of ongoing political and social experiments, often chaotic and driven by new forces rather than clear plans.
What were some of these key political experiments?
Well, Holland, the Dutch Republic, emerging as a successful Protestant republican state after casting off Spanish rule, is one example. England went through its own tumultuous period, experiments with royal absolutism under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, followed by conflicts between Parliament and the Stuart kings, James I and Charles I, which ultimately wrecked the monarchy's claims to absolute power.
Charles I's execution for treason by Parliament in 1649 is highlighted as a particularly radical moment, a new turn in the political thought of Europe.
Definitely. Britain actually functioned as a republic, a commonwealth, for about a dozen years under Oliver Cromwell. And even after the monarchy was restored in 1660, its power was permanently curtailed and unstable, leading eventually to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. France, meanwhile, under Louis XIV later in the 17th century, presented a different, highly influential model, the centralized, absolutist grand monarchy, which became an example or an aspiration for many other European rulers.
And alongside these internal political experiments, European expansion overseas, fueled by those earlier discoveries and new shipping technologies, continued relentlessly and competitively.
Yes, the initial dominance of Portugal and Spain was increasingly challenged by the Dutch, the French, and the British. European wars now frequently spilled over to colonial theaters around the globe, from North America to India. European powers asserted their right to claim vast territories inhabited by non-Christian peoples, often ignoring earlier papal decrees that had attempted to partition the world between Spain and Portugal.
And Britain, ultimately, came out on top in this global scramble for empire. Why does the source suggest Britain was so successful?
Wells attributes Britain's success partly to the strategic advantage of their island geography, that silver streak of the English Channel, providing a degree of protection. He also argues they were less bound by the complex, backward-looking traditions and entanglements of the old Latin Roman Empire compared to continental powers like France or the Holy Roman Empire Habsburgs. France, he suggests, often thought too much in terms of purely European rivalries and dynastic ambitions. Furthermore, English religious dissenters played a key role by seeking refuge and settling permanently in North America, establishing colonies with deep roots, rather than just focusing on trading posts or resource extraction.
Other European powers were also expanding significantly during this period, weren't they?
Oh yes. Russia began its relentless eastward expansion across Siberia from the 17th century onward, primarily driven by Cossack adventurers seeking furs and land, eventually reaching the Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, the vast Ottoman Empire, while still powerful, was gradually beginning to shrink, facing increasing pressure and territorial losses from both Russia in the north and, at times, Persia, under new dynasties, in the east, as well as Habsburg Austria in Europe. By the third quarter of the 18th century, the eve of the next great wave of revolutions, Europe is described as politically fragmented, divided by rivalries, lacking any single unifying idea, yet collectively wielding unprecedented global dominance, particularly along coastlines, thanks to its advantage in books, maps, ships, and military technology. It was, as well as Caliphates puts it, a planless, incoherent ebullition of new forces.
And these powerful new forces soon boiled over into major revolutions, shaking the foundations of the old order. The American War of Independence is the first major example discussed.
Right. Triggered by British attempts to assert greater administrative control and impose new taxes on the prosperous 13 colonies after the costly 7 Years' War, French and Indian War. Led by figures like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, the colonies rebelled against what they saw as violations of their rights as Englishmen. The source makes a point of noting that Britain notably maintained the lucrative slave trade despite opposition from colonies like Virginia. King George III's personality and perceived intransigence are also cited by Wells as contributing factors to the escalating conflict.
The colonies eventually united, declared independence, and, with crucial help from France, won their independence after a long struggle.
Yes. Forming the United States of America, initially governed loosely under the Articles of Confederation, but then establishing a more robust federal system under the Constitution, ratified in 1789. Canada, however, remained loyal to the British Crown.
Almost immediately after the American Revolution concluded, an even more radical and far-reaching revolution erupted in France, at the very heart of that grand monarchy that had seemed the pinnacle of European order.
The French Revolution, the source argues, grew out of deep-seated systemic injustice and inequality. The summoning of the Estates General in 1789 quickly transformed into the Revolutionary National Assembly, and the Bourbon monarchy rapidly lost control, collapsing with astonishing speed. The storming of the Bastille prison in Paris became a powerful symbol of the uprising. Insurrection spread like wildfire across the countryside, with peasants burning chateaux and destroying the title deeds that symbolized feudal obligations. Provisional city governments, communes, and a new citizens' militia, the National Guard, were formed.
The revolution unleashed incredibly powerful universalist ideas, liberty, equality, fraternity, but it also quickly led to internal chaos, the Reign of Terror, and external war with the monarchies of Europe who were terrified the revolution would spread.
Exactly. France found itself at war with most of Europe. Remarkably, the revolutionary French armies, composed of motivated citizen soldiers, managed to drive invading Austrian and Prussian forces out of France, conquer Belgium, and even establish satellite republics in places like Holland, where the Dutch fleet was famously captured by French cavalry charging across the frozen Texel sea ice.
The source describes the nature of this revolutionary French army as something new and formidable.
Yes, composed of men willing to suffer immense hardship for the cause, utilizing unprecedented rapidity of movement and innovating tactics like living off the land they campaigned in, essentially marking the birth of the modern system of war, based on mass mobilization and national ideology rather than just professional mercenaries.
And it was from these revolutionary wars that the figure who would dominate the next era emerged, Napoleon Bonaparte.
A brilliant and ambitious young general who rose rapidly through the ranks. He eventually seized political power in a coup d'etat, becoming first consul in 1799, and then crowning himself Emperor of the French in 1804. Wells notes Napoleon consciously imitated historical figures like Charlemagne, even having the Pope present for his coronation, but pointedly placing the imperial crown on his own head.
Napoleon won a stunning series of military victories, dominating continental Europe west of Russia for over a decade.
He did, but crucially, he failed to gain command of the sea from Great Britain, whose navy remained supreme after the Battle of Trafalgar. His disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 fatally weakened his grand army. He was decisively defeated by a coalition of European powers at the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, in 1813, forced to abdicate in exile to the island of Elba. He made a dramatic return for the 100 Days, but was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815.
What happened in Europe after Napoleon's final defeat?
The monarchy was restored in France, though it would prove unstable. The victorious powers convened the Congress of Vienna in 1814-15 to redraw the map of Europe, attempting to restore the old order and create a balance of power that would prevent future revolutions and wars on such a scale. Europe entered a period of uneasy peace, but the forces of nationalism and liberalism unleashed by the revolution continued to simmer beneath the surface.
And the revolutionary wave had impacts beyond Europe, too.
Definitely. The Spanish colonies in South and Central America took advantage of the chaos in Spain, when Napoleon placed his brother on the Spanish throne, to launch their own successful wars of independence, led by figures like Simón Bolívar, whom this source calls the George Washington of South America. Revolts inspired by liberal or nationalist ideas also flared up elsewhere in Europe in the following decades, notably in Italy, Germany, and Greece in the 1820s and 1830s. A major Polish uprising against Russian rule was brutally stamped out.
So a period of immense political upheaval. But alongside these revolutions and wars, the source delves deeply into another, perhaps even more profound, set of transformations: the ongoing scientific revolution and the burgeoning industrial revolution.
Right. Wells emphasizes that the rapid development of material knowledge, of science and technology, initially proceeded somewhat disconnected from the day-to-day political life of nations, and its profound impact on popular thought and society only became fully apparent later. Much of the early scientific work relied on independent private gentlemen scientists, often working outside established institutions, somewhat similar perhaps to the early Greek philosophers.
Though universities eventually played a role.
Yes, eventually, but not necessarily the leading role initially. Scientific societies like the Royal Society in Britain, founded in 1662, became important forums for sharing discoveries. This period saw significant advances in systematic measurement, classification, like the work of Linnaeus in biology and Buffon in natural history, and the emergence of new scientific fields like geology and paleontology, which began revealing the immense age of the Earth and the history of life.
And then came the invention that really kick-started the industrial age in earnest.
The practical and efficient steam engine, particularly James Watt's, improved designs in the latter half of the 18th century. This invention unleashed truly revolutionary changes across society.
Most immediately, perhaps, ushering in a transport revolution.
Absolutely. Steam-powered railways, developing rapidly from the 1820s onward, dramatically reduced chief European distances to about a tenth, as Wells puts it. This sped up travel, communication, and the movement of goods to an unprecedented degree. It allowed for the effective administration of much larger geographical areas, and crucially, Wells argues, it was essential for ensuring the political unity of the vast, expanding United States.
And steam power took to the water as well.
Yes, the steamboat emerged. The source mentions early examples like Robert Fulton's Clermont operating on the Hudson River in 1807, the Phoenix making the first sea voyage by steam, and the Savannah achieving the first Atlantic crossing partially under steam power in 1819. Initial paddle wheel designs had limitations for ocean travel, but the later development of the screw propeller made steamships truly dominant. And alongside steam, the invention of the electric telegraph provided near-instantaneous communication over long distances, another vital component of this transport and communication revolution.
The pace of technical knowledge development during this era, particularly the 19th century, is described by the source as simply extraordinary.
Extraordinary rapidity, far exceeding anything seen in all previous ages of human history. A key area of advancement highlighted is the mastery over iron and steel production.
How so?
New techniques like the Bessemer process, developed in 1856, and the open hearth process around 1864 allowed for the melting, purifying, and casting of steel and iron cheaply and on an unprecedented industrial scale. Wells calls the impact of cheap steel incomparable in its consequences.
So leading to massive changes in infrastructure and engineering.
Exactly. It enabled the construction of extensive railway networks, large ships built entirely of iron and later steel, vast bridges spanning previously unbridgeable gaps, and building on a gigantic new scale. Think skyscrapers later on. Engineers quickly realized that the initial railway gauges were too timid for the potential of this new material. Ship sizes ballooned from maybe 2,000 tons to 50,000 tons within decades.
And the potential of electric power also began to be seriously understood and harnessed during this time.
Yes. The possibility of generating electricity centrally and sending power efficiently along copper wires became a practical reality, opening up possibilities for lighting, motors, and new forms of communication. The leading peoples in this explosion of scientific inquiry and technological application were initially the British and French. But Wells notes the Germans later showed particular zeal and tenacity in catching up and often surpassing them in certain fields.
The source makes an interesting and important distinction between the scientific process itself and what we call the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, it presents the Industrial Revolution primarily as a social and financial development. The rise of factories, wage labor, capitalism, urbanization that happened alongside and interacted with the scientific and technological advancements, but was distinct from them. Wells even argues that an industrial revolution, in the sense of a shift away from traditional agricultural society and towards mass production and new forms of labor, probably would have occurred even without coal, steam, or complex machinery.
Really? But how? What path would it have taken?
He suggests it likely would have followed a darker path, similar to the decline of the Roman Republic. The dispossession of free farmers and artisans, replaced by vast enterprises relying on coerced, unfree labor, essentially, a return to something like mass slavery, powered by human muscle under compulsion.
So why did Europe, particularly Britain where the Industrial Revolution began, take a different path? One built on harnessing cheap mechanical power rather than exploiting mass human labor in that way.
The source points to a combination of factors unique to Europe's situation at the time. Firstly, Europe's persistent political disunity and the frequent convulsions against monarchical power created a less rigidly controlled environment. Secondly, the recalcitrance of the common folk, perhaps with longer traditions of resisting complete subjugation compared to the diverse populations enslaved by Rome, made mass enslavement more difficult. Thirdly, there was a greater accessibility to and interest in mechanical ideas and invention compared to earlier societies.
And any other factors?
Crucially, Wells argues that ideas of human solidarity and individual worth, largely stemming from the influence of Christianity over centuries, were more widely diffused throughout European society, creating a stronger, though often ignored, moral resistance to outright mass enslavement of fellow Europeans. Also, political power was generally less centralized than in the mature Roman Empire, allowing for more local initiative and less top-down control.
That's a fascinating and complex argument, attributing the avoidance of a Roman-style slave-based industrialization to a mix of political fragmentation, social resistance, technological ingenuity, and underlying cultural or religious values.
It really is. The core shift Wells identifies is fundamental. The old world, for millennia, was powered overwhelmingly by human muscle slaves, serfs, peasants, laborers, supplemented by some animal power. Modern industrial civilization, in contrast, was rebuilt on the foundation of cheap, abundant mechanical power derived from fossil fuels. As he puts it, power itself became progressively cheaper, while human labor, relatively speaking, became dearer over the 100 years or so leading up to his writing. Machines increasingly replaced human beings in heavy tasks like agriculture and mining.
A truly fundamental change in the very engine driving human civilization. Now, this material progress, this explosion of scientific knowledge and industrial power, was happening alongside the slower, perhaps more complex development of modern social and political ideas.
Right. Wells contrasts the slow, often undesigned evolution of social ideas in most of ancient history with the conscious, critical thinking about human relationships and the deliberate proposing of alterations to establish beliefs and laws that began, he argues, primarily with the Greek philosophers in the 6th century BC, like Plato and Aristotle.
But he notes that the first fruits of modern intellectual progress, from the Renaissance onward, were primarily material achievements and the accumulation of power. The sciences dealing directly with human relationships, psychology, sociology, economics, education, developed much more slowly. Why was that?
He suggests several reasons. These human sciences deal with phenomena that are inherently more subtle, intricate, and harder to measure objectively than physical phenomena. They're also deeply bound up with human emotions and values, and perhaps most importantly, they face much greater inherent opposition because, as the source puts it, ideas about our ways of life touch and reflect upon everyone about us. Changing ideas about physics doesn't usually threaten your personal life or status in the same immediate way that challenging established ideas about property, family, or social structure does.
That makes sense. The source introduces socialism in this context. How is it presented?
It's presented primarily as a critical response to, and questioning of, the traditional idea of private property, particularly in light of the perceived needs and well-being of the broader public good in the new industrial age. Wells acknowledges the diversity of socialist thought, noting there are 1,000 sects of socialists, but sees the core impulse as this critical examination of property rights.
How does he trace the idea of property itself?
He argues it arises fundamentally from basic, perhaps even animalistic, combative, and possessive instincts, what a beast will fight for. He dismisses the notion of primitive communism as a nonsensical expression, arguing instead that even the old man, leader of a primitive human group, likely insisted on personal proprietorship over wives, daughters, tools, maybe even his perceived territory or universe. This evolved through tribal ownership into the system of private property familiar in agricultural societies.
But this idea wasn't unchallenged.
No. Christianity, the source notes, significantly shook the ancient acceptance of property in human beings, slavery, even if the practice persisted for centuries. It also introduced ethical challenges to the idea that a person can simply do what he likes with his own property, emphasizing stewardship and obligations to the community.
By the 18th century, though, Enlightenment thinking about property was still largely focused on protecting it.
Yes, protecting private property against the arbitrary claims of kings and nobles. That was the primary impulse of thinkers like John Locke.
But the modern trend described by Wells, looking towards the early 20th century, is a gradual convergence towards what he calls a moderate socialism, scientifically studied and planned. What does he mean by that?
He sees a growing realization, driven by the complexities of industrial society, that untutored individuals don't easily or naturally cooperate effectively in large, complex undertakings. This necessitates the state taking on a greater role in organizing and managing complex functions like infrastructure, public health, and perhaps key industries for the benefit of the whole society. The transition from a primarily property-asserting mindset to a more socially conscious, perhaps property-negating or property-regulating one, is seen as a slow but ongoing process.
He also introduces the concept of internationalism.
Yes, which he defines quite simply as the socialism of nations. He views nationalistic rivalries and imperialistic greed as being parallel to individual possessiveness and selfishness products, he suggests, of the same underlying primal instincts and historical ignorances, just operating on a larger scale.
But Wells is not overly optimistic. He acknowledges the significant challenges facing humanity in achieving these more cooperative and rational social and international orders.
Definitely. He points to the lack of sufficient scientific understanding of human psychology, both individual and group, the absence of effective globally planned education systems, and the lack of robust international organizations needed for a real solution to the persistent riddles of human conflict and cooperation. He argues that narrow and obsolete ideas about tribe, nation, and race have to be replaced by a clearer and a simpler conception of the common origins and destinies of our kind.
So a massive intellectual and educational reconstruction is necessary and, he believes, ongoing, though still very incomplete. Conceptions of global unity and cooperation are growing clearer and gathering power, but face immense obstacles. The source then shifts focus geographically again, looking at the dramatic expansion of the United States in the 19th century.
Right. This expansion is described as a process with no precedent, a fundamentally new kind of occurrence in world history. Wells argues that a nation-state of that continental scale simply could not have existed, or at least survived, as a single entity before the invention of the railways and the telegraph. These technologies were absolutely essential for ensuring communication, administration, and political unity across those vast distances.
But within this rapidly expanding and industrializing nation, a fundamental, deeply divisive conflict was intensifying throughout the first half of the 19th century.
Yes, the deepening conflict between the southern states, whose economy and society were fundamentally based on slave labor, and the northern states, which had abolished slavery and were based on free labor and industry. The very technologies like railways and steamboats that were binding the nation together physically also served, ironically, to sharpen the awareness of these profound cultural and economic differences.
It became an urgent question.
Exactly. The question of which fundamental spirit, the southern slaveholding one or the northern free labor one, would ultimately define the character of the expanding nation became increasingly urgent, with seemingly little possibility of lasting compromise.
This, of course, led inevitably to the American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865.
A brutal and transformative struggle primarily, from the northern perspective, fought to preserve the Union. The source portrays the North as essentially forcing the issue of abolition on the resistant South, leading to immense strain, bitterness, and divided families across the nation.
Abraham Lincoln, the president during the war, is highlighted.
Yes, he's depicted as facing almost overwhelming difficulties, but remaining steadfast, a grim monument of resolve, sometimes using humor to cope with the immense pressure. He saw the Union ultimately triumph, and his primary goal after the war's end was reconciliation and the reconstruction of the devastated South. Tragically, he was assassinated in April 1865, just days after the Confederate surrender.
Briefly, the source also notes the concurrent rise of Germany during the latter half of the 19th century.
Yes. After the fall of Napoleon and the subsequent reorganization of German states, Prussia gradually rose to predominance, unifying Germany through a series of wars under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck. By the early 20th century, a powerful, industrialized, and unified German empire had emerged as the predominant military and economic power in continental Europe.
This changing balance of power in Europe, coupled with the technological advancements we discussed, sets the stage for the next phase of global history described in the source, the era of the new overseas empires, built primarily in the late 19th century on the back of the steamship and the railway.
Right. Wells contrasts the relatively limited extent of European overseas possessions back in 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, with the situation by 1900. In 1815, the British held Canada, some West Indies islands, British Guiana, and essentially convict dumps in Australia and Tasmania. Yeah. Spain still had Cuba and the Philippines. Portugal retained vestiges of its older empire in Africa and Asia. Holland held the valuable East Indies, Indonesia, and Dutch Guiana. France had some West Indies islands and French Guiana. That seemed perhaps the limit of European expansion at the time.
But the focus and nature of global trade began to shift dramatically during the 19th century.
Yes. The infamous Atlantic slave trade was gradually suppressed. Trade shifted initially towards commodities like cattle hides and coffee from places like Argentina. But increasingly, industrializing Europe demanded vast quantities of raw materials, minerals like gold, diamonds, copper, tin, but also agricultural products like ivory, palm oil, cotton, and especially rubber, often sourced from previously unsettled or inaccessible tropical regions. This drove a new, intense wave of exploration and colonization.
India is a key example of this consolidation of imperial power.
Absolutely. The British East India Company, initially a trading entity, gradually transformed itself into the dominant political and military power on the subcontinent, becoming de facto conquerors. The map of India took shape with vast British provinces directly administered, surrounding numerous nominally independent native states under British influence. After the major Indian Mutiny, or Sepoy Rebellion, of 1857-58, the British Crown took over direct control from the company in 1859.
Australia and New Zealand also became significant areas of British settlement and control.
Yes. Australia, initially those convict settlements, began to attract free settlers and develop its own economic potential, particularly with sheep farming and gold rushes. New Zealand was formally added to the British possessions in 1840 after the Treaty of Waitangi with Maori chiefs, though conflict followed.
And then there was the infamous scramble for Africa in the last decades of the 19th century.
Wells describes this with stark realism. Europeans rapidly penetrated the interior of Africa, aided by new technologies like quinine against malaria and improved firearms. They often found that firearms had already preceded them via trade routes. In an astonishingly short period, roughly between 1880 and 1900, virtually the entire African continent was mapped, explored, claimed, and divided up among the European powers: Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, Italy.
With little regard for the inhabitants.
The source is blunt. Little heed was given to the welfare of the natives. While the older Arab slave trade routes were often disrupted or suppressed by European powers, the insatiable greed for resources like wild rubber, particularly in places like King Leopold's Congo Free State, led to horrific brutality and exploitation that was arguably just as bad, if not worse.
And European imperial ambition wasn't limited just to conquering regions perceived as savage or unsettled.
No, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it expanded towards carving up or establishing spheres of influence within long-established, populous and civilized countries of Asia that were perceived as weak or disintegrating, notably Persia, Iran, the crumbling Ottoman Empire, and even vast China itself. The existing British and Dutch empires in India and the East Indies served as models and justifications for these newer imperial ventures by other European powers.
A fascinating counterpoint, or perhaps parallel development, to this relentless Western expansion is Japan's dramatic transformation during the same period.
Yes. Japan provides a unique case study. It had largely closed itself off from Europeans back in the 17th century, wary of the political interference often associated with Catholic missionaries, based on earlier experiences, and the perceived threat of Western colonization. Their only limited, controlled link to the West was through the small Dutch trading post on the artificial island of Tsushima in Nagasaki Harbor.
But through that very limited contact, they received warnings about what was happening in the outside world.
Yes, the Dutch apparently warned the Japanese shogunate that Japan was falling dangerously behind the military and technological advancements being made in the West, particularly after Britain's easy victory over China in the First Opium War. American whaling ships also began appearing more frequently in Japanese waters.
This eventually led to a confrontation.
Yes. After some earlier unsuccessful attempts by others, Commodore Matthew Perry's U.S. naval expedition arrived in 1853 and again in 1854 with technologically superior steam warships, black ships, and effectively forced the reluctant Tokugawa shogunate to sign treaties opening Japanese ports to foreign trade and residence.
And Japan's reaction to this forced opening was incredibly swift and comprehensive, wasn't it?
Astonishingly so. Seeing their vulnerability in the fate of China, Japan's elite initiated a period of rapid, fundamental top-down change known as the Meiji Restoration, starting in 1868. They deliberately abolished the old feudal system, centralized power under the emperor, and consciously adopted Western institutions and technologies. They created a modern conscript army and navy based on European models, established a national education system, and fostered industrial development. Japan transformed itself into a constitutionally limited monarchy within just a few decades.
Japan's successful war against China in 1894-95 dramatically demonstrated the effectiveness of these reforms.
It really did. It showed the world they had created an efficient, modern military capable of defeating their much larger neighbor. The source notes that Britain and the U.S. quickly appreciated the significance of this, recognizing Japan as a rising power and treating it more as a peer, like a European state, culminating in the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902. Other European powers, however, were perhaps slower to fully grasp the implications of Japan's rapid modernization.
Looking back at the British Empire itself around the turn of the 20th century, how does the source characterize it?
As a vast, complex, and somewhat accidental entity, a mixture of disparate growths and acquisitions, not planned or designed by any single brain or coherent ideology, Wells suggests it managed to endure, despite its own official tyrannies, inconsistencies, and negligence, partly because it did manage to guarantee a wide peace and security for many of its diverse subject races across the globe, suppressing local warfare and facilitating trade within its vast borders.
But the period after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, which saw the unification of Germany, ushered in a new, more dangerous era in Europe.
Yes, Wells describes the decades after 1871 as becoming an age of armament, characterized by an intensifying drift towards a major war. The European great powers engaged in fierce competition for global markets, resources, and colonial territories, and simultaneously armed themselves to the teeth with the products of the very industrial revolution we discussed: modern rifles, machine guns, artillery, steel battleships.
It was this toxic combination of imperial rivalry, nationalism, and the complex system of military alliances and entanglements that created the highly volatile conditions leading directly to the outbreak of World War I in 1914.
The source refers to it simply as the Great War, which raged from 1914 to 1918. It emphasizes the unprecedented scale and sheer destructiveness of modern, industrialized warfare.
Giving examples.
Grim examples like the utter ruins of cities like Ypres in Belgium, pulverized by artillery, and the vast, desolate landscapes scarred by trench warfare and endless barbed wire entanglements. New, terrifying technologies like poison gas and the British tank emerged, and the air offensive intensified throughout the war, subjecting major cities like London and Paris to previously unimaginable nightly bombing raids and bringing the conditions of a siege directly to civilian populations far from the front lines.
A key factor discussed in the source regarding the war's course and outcome is Russia's involvement and eventual collapse.
Right. Profound disillusionment and disgust with the incompetent and autocratic Tsarist regime spread rapidly through the poorly equipped and badly led Russian army, suffering immense casualties. From 1915 onward, Russia became a source of increasing anxiety for its Western allies, Britain and France. The notorious influence of Rasputin at court was seen as a symptom of the regime's decay before he was murdered in December 1916.
And the Tsardom itself finally collapsed.
Yes, in March 1917, amidst widespread food shortages, strikes, and riots in Petrograd, St. Petersburg. The Tsar abdicated, and a provisional government, initially liberal and Republican, took power. However, the source is quite critical of how Russia's Western allies handled this transition. Wells states they were largely ignorant and blundered, showing little real understanding or goodwill towards the fragile new republic, primarily concerned with keeping Russia in the war against Germany at all costs. But the Russian people, soldiers and civilians alike, were utterly exhausted by the war and desperately wanted peace at any cost. Alternative centers of power, the Soviets' councils representing workers, soldiers, and peasants emerged and gained influence.
This created an opening for the Bolsheviks.
Exactly. The radical Bolshevik faction of the socialist movement, led by Vladimir Lenin, capitalized on the chaos and the provisional government's perceived weakness and continuation of the hated war. They offered simple, powerful promises: peace, land for the peasants and bread for the starving cities.
Leading to the Bolshevik Revolution in November 1917, October by the old Russian calendar.
Yes, they seized power in Petrograd. One of their first acts was to seek an armistice with Germany. Russia effectively withdrew from the war, eventually signing the punitive Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in early 1918, ceding vast territories. What followed in Russia was years of devastating civil war between the Bolshevik Reds and their counter-revolutionary white opponents, often backed by the former Allies.
The consequences were dire.
Immense chaos and destruction. Railways and towns were ruined, industry collapsed, and there was immense mortality from fighting, disease, and hunger. The source specifically mentions the terrible famine that struck the southeastern provinces in 1921, where millions starved to death. Wells explicitly notes at this point in his narrative that discussing the complexities and controversies of the Russian Revolution and its aftermath is too close to current controversies to be discussed here, reflecting the sensitivity and recency of these events at the time he was writing, early 1920s.
A clear boundary drawn by the author himself regarding contemporary events. Looking back at the outcome of the Great War as a whole, how does the source assess its impact?
It acknowledges that the war did destroy some superannuated and obstructive things, like the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, and several monarchies across Europe. But Wells argues crucially, the underlying system of competing nation-states, with their national flags, fortified frontiers, and large armies, remained fundamentally intact. The war hadn't ushered in a truly new world order.
The peace conference held at Versailles in 1919 is presented as deeply flawed in the source.
Yes, Wells describes the conference participants, particularly the leaders of the victorious Allied powers, as being very ill-adapted to the task of building a lasting peace, or doing much more than simply carrying out the conclusions determined by the war itself. Germany and the other defeated nations were notably excluded from the main negotiations and essentially had terms dictated to them.
U.S. President Woodrow Wilson brought his proposal for a League of Nations to the conference. How is that portrayed?
As a well-intentioned, idealistic American world project, but ultimately, in Wells's view, a sketchy, inadequate, and dangerous scheme. He argues that because it was taken in Europe as representing the mature, considered view of the United States, which then crucially failed to even join the League itself, it actually became a serious obstacle in the way of any effective reorganization of international relationships. It wasn't radical or comprehensive enough, in his opinion, to address the fundamental problems that has led to the war.
But despite this sharp critique of the official League structure created at Versailles, the source does acknowledge a powerful underlying desire for change among the public worldwide.
Yes, very much so. It highlights the worldwide blaze of enthusiasm that initially greeted the general idea of the League of Nations. It showed, Wells believed, the readiness of ordinary people, men as distinguished from governments, for some kind of effective world control of war. The popular desire for peace and genuine international cooperation was clearly there, even if the political leadership failed to deliver an adequate instrument for it.
So, after this entire sweeping narrative of history, where does Wells leave us, the reader, facing the daunting challenges of the early 20th century world?
He ends his short history by reiterating that the fundamental challenges facing humanity, preventing future wars, managing global resources, achieving social justice, require significant advancements in the sciences that deal directly with human relationships: personal and group psychology, economics, sociology, education. These sciences, he stresses, are still in their relative infancy compared to the physical sciences.
The most urgent need, then, is intellectual and educational.
Yes, the urgent need is to replace the narrow and obsolete ideas about nation, race, and sovereignty that continue to divide humanity with a clearer and a simpler conception of the common origins and destinies of our kind.
Dangers and confusion clearly remain, but he holds out some hope.
Yes. He suggests that genuine peace and a prosperous future for all are possible, given wisdom. That essential intellectual reconstruction is ongoing, perhaps slowly, perhaps unevenly. But the necessary conceptions of human unity and shared destiny are growing clearer and gradually gathering power.
Wow. What an absolutely incredible, almost breathtaking journey through time and the vast sweep of human experience. From the fiery, chaotic beginnings of the Earth itself, through the incredibly slow emergence and evolution of life, the rise and fall of countless empires and civilizations, the birth of philosophy and the world's major religions, the dramatic, accelerating transformations of the scientific and industrial revolutions, and right up to the violent upheavals and uncertain prospects of the early 20th century, all viewed through the unique, encompassing lens of H.G. Wells.
It really does give you that powerful sense of the immense patterns, the recurring themes, and the crucial turning points in the story of our planet and our species. And those unexpected details will include, like the lingulus shellfish still living today, the Minoan palans having running water, that surprising link he draws between medieval alchemy and the birth of modern science, his often blunt assessments of famous historical figures, the specific critiques he levels against long-standing institutions like the Holy Roman Empire or newer ones like the League of Nations, and his particular, sometimes controversial analyses of complex events like why Rome fell or why Europe industrialized differently. These are the kinds of nuggets that really make the history feel alive and help provide that well-informed perspective relatively quickly.
They really do stick with you, don't they? And building directly on that final point Wells makes about the immense challenges of the modern era and the fundamental need for new ways of thinking, the source leaves us with a really powerful, maybe even essential thought to consider. Given the vast sweep of human history we've just traversed, all the cycles of conflict and cooperation, creativity and destruction, Wells ultimately concludes that building a truly stable and peaceful global future isn't just about getting the political structures or the international treaties right. It fundamentally hinges on a profound shift in human understanding itself, on cultivating, as he puts it, a clearer and a simpler conception of the common origins and destinies of our kind.
A potent reminder, perhaps, that the most profound and necessary changes might ultimately need to happen within ourselves and how we perceive the world and our place within it.
Exactly. A challenging thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.